to be Pharisees could follow Jesus. And Paul is a guy who knows how empty the life of a Pharisee was. And Jesus encountered him and changed him. And he says, I cannot believe you would turn away from the freedom God gives you. I'm astonished that you would turn away from the one who called you. And there's something going on here that we don't see in our English translations, largely because our English translations want to make everything between G and PG. But Paul uses a two-word phrase that most literally can be translated slightly differently. In fact, I remember when I was a kid, my parents told me there were two words that I could never, ever say that I'm now allowed to say as a pastor. You can't say them, but I can say them as a pastor because they show up in my Bible sometimes. One of them is the donkey that Balaam rides on, or that Jesus rides on, if I'm reading the King James Version. I can say that bad word sometimes, you know. I can say a donkey, you know, from the King James Version. I can read that one. Here's the other one, though, that pastors are sometimes known for saying, and it's the one that Paul uses here, and I have to change this just a little bit into that so that you understand the intensity with which Paul is attacking this vicious lie. Paul uses the word damn. Because what he says in this passage is he uses two words. In the Greek, it's anathema him. And anathema is a word that you can translate it, let him be condemned. Let him be condemned. That's the way it works. It's a third-person imperative. It's a command that someone else should do something. But our English word for that is just damn. God says, through Paul, anyone who says anything differently needs to be damned. Damn anyone who preaches anything different from what Paul preached. Damn anyone who preaches anything different from what they received. It's so offensive, so bad. Paul is livid that someone would preach this and that people would accept it. No matter how free we are, if someone tells us we need to do something different, there's a part of us that's like, man, maybe I need to walk into that. There's something attractive about slavery, like the tree in the garden. There's something attractive about walking into bondage. We can't accept when someone says you're free. What is the message that Paul preached? What is the message they received? Well, you have to go back into Acts chapter 13 when Paul was teaching these churches. Okay, so flip over to the next page, you'll see this. We tell you the good news. This is Paul talking to the churches in Galatia as he's preaching this message for the first time to them. We tell you the good news. That's the word gospel. What God promised our fathers, He has fulfilled for us, their children, by raising up Jesus. As it is written in the second Psalm, you are my son, today I've become your father. Therefore, my brothers, I want you to know that through Jesus, the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. Through Him, everyone who believes is justified from everything you could not be justified from by the law of Moses. Paul says, because Jesus raised from the dead, we can be forgiven and justified. There are three components to this gospel. Go ahead and write these things down. First of all is the promise to Abraham is fulfilled for us in the resurrection of Jesus. Everything God says in the Old Testament, everything God says is a promise to His people, the promise of a future forever, the promise of life and blessing. Those promises are for you and for me, everyone. These promises are made available for everyone, for us, because of Jesus' resurrection. Number two, Jesus' death on the cross provides total forgiveness for sin. Complete. It's not like Jesus' death covers a certain number of sins and you have to pay for the rest. It's not like Jesus' death covers over just, the sins that you committed before you became a Christian, and then after you become a Christian, you have to pay for those yourself. It's not that Jesus' death pays for the sin of your parents, but you have to pay for your own sin. It's nothing like that. Jesus' death is big enough, huge enough to cover every possible sin that's ever been done, including all of your future and your past. Total forgiveness. And then the third thing Paul says is that faith in Jesus is what connects me to that Total justification. The word justification is a word Paul uses for the first time when talking about spiritual things. And he uses that word because justification means you've never done anything wrong. You know what I mean when you do something wrong and then you justify it? You're like, oh, it wasn't really that bad? That's what God says about you. You're not really that bad. In fact, justification means that God says about you, you're totally cool. You're perfect. You've never done anything wrong. Because see, the word justification in the original language simply means to make righteous. To make you into a person who never does the wrong thing. I asked the kids this morning, I was leading some music in Kiddopolis in the city, and I asked them all, how many of you have made a mistake this last week? And half of them raised their hands. I won't tell you which ones kept them down. Half of them raised their hands. Some of the leaders were raising their hands. If I asked that question to you, would you be able to say, yeah, I made a mistake this week? You know what God would say? Nope. My son's death took care of that. As far as I'm concerned, you're clean. You're good. You've never done anything wrong. You're justified. Just as if I'd never sinned. You see, what God is doing is He's opening the Garden of Eden to you. He's saying, there's a whole world of freedom I want you to experience. And there's just a gateway. The gateway is Jesus. You just need to be connected to Him. But if you're connected to Him, you can enter into this garden that's completely free, completely open to you. Be, live, experience freedom. Not a whole long list of stuff, but you've never made a mistake if you're with Jesus. See, this is so important to Paul because he tried and tried and tried. He was a Pharisee. He was the best of the Pharisees. He was so good as a Pharisee that he was killing the people who didn't measure up. He was perfect. He was everything anyone wanted to be, and he realized he needed God's grace. You and I fall short. Why don't we run to God's grace and forgiveness? Two last things I want to say. One is that slavery has gravity. Write this down. Paul says to the Galatians, I'm astonished that you're so quickly turning away from the one who called you to accept this other message. I'm astonished, Paul says, that you would turn away from forgiveness and grace and just go back and trying to do all the things that God says to do in the Old Testament. Just keep doing them, keep doing them, keep doing them. I'm astonished that you would give up forgiveness for a whole long list of laws. Paul says, I'm astonished about that. And it's because slavery has gravity. It pulls us back all the time. You know why? Because we choose to do the things that we think are going to give us freedom, and we find bondage there. And then we realize we found bondage there, and so then we feel like we have to do something to get out of that bondage. And so we aren't going to come back to church because, you know what? Church is for the good people, and I just screwed up this last week. I got to get my act together before I can come back to church, before I can be around all those other people, because we all know they didn't make any mistakes this last week. And I can't, no. Paul says, listen, slavery has gravity, but don't let it get you. Fight for your freedom. This is the last thing to write down. The freedom of forgiveness is worth fighting for. Just as much as Paul was ready to kill people, he was ready to lash out at people with some words. Now, he didn't murder anyone in Galatia or in Jerusalem. He lashed out with some words a little bit. We're going to see a little bit of how that tendency comes up. But listen, God picked Paul for this purpose, for this meaning, for this reason. He knew he needed a fighter to get people to realize they were forgiven and free. Totally forgiven and free. Properly understood. Your behavior needs to be the result of your freedom. Properly understood, you need to see the Bible and its rules, its regulations, its guidelines, and proper behavior as the protector of your freedom. Properly understood, You need to be motivated to be free. Now, listen. As we finish the book of Galatians over these next few weeks, particularly towards the end, you're going to hear me say things like you need to and you've got to. Periodically from this stage, I will talk about behavior. I will talk about doing the right things. I will talk about sexual ethics. I will talk about how to use your mouth. I will talk about how to use your feet and how to use your hands. And I will talk about how to use the time God has given you. I will talk about how to use your money. And I will talk about all the different kinds of behaviors that you and I should be doing in our lives. From time to time, we're going to be talking about the right way to live. But listen, none of that is going to have any truth for you if you take it as law. It's only going to have truth for you if you realize that these are the things that provide for and protect your freedom. When God gives us a regulation, He's not saying, here's something I'm keeping from you. He's saying, here's something that will enslave you. Don't go there. Don't go there. Walk in the freedom I'm giving you. Enjoy this go-kart. Pay no attention to the walls. Just live in freedom.